The European Training Foundation is an agency of the European Union, and our main mandate is to work on promoting human capital development in countries outside of the European Union, with a strong focus on supporting reforms of training and education systems. Therefore, it's particularly a pleasure for me to contribute to this discussion from the education and training angle, and thanks also to IT Digital for setting up this possibility to discuss upskilling. As the Commissioner said, there is a lot of interest on skills development across the board. This is something which has been a marker of the past few years. It has accompanied the transformation that the previous panelists referred to in terms of industry and telecom. But it goes deeper now, and I think there is a realization that skills development is the factor of success for the future for many and most countries, and therefore the political attention on skills development is at the highest. The challenge for those of us working on supporting skills development reforms is to take this opportunity and make sure that we can meet some of the growing expectations. The Commissioner referred to the skills agenda that the European Union is working on, and upskilling will be central. If we look at what has been happening in the COVID-19 reaction, and we look at the education systems, I think we have just witnessed one of the biggest upskilling experiments, as Professor just used the word, in the education sector, where millions of teachers had to overnight find ways to gain new ways of performing their usual tasks, but through different means, and understanding, also bringing a new understanding to the way in which they interact. So I think for those, all of us looking at upskilling, we are actually seeing in front of our eyes one of the biggest such transformations. I will just focus on 3 points in this short introduction, but I will point you to a publication that we have just issued yesterday on the European Training Foundation site, and I think it's been made available to the organizers, which sums up some of our current thinking based on monitoring that we have been doing of 25 partner countries and how they've reacted to COVID in the education sector. So we have been doing weekly monitoring with them, comparing responses, and we have issued a report yesterday specifically on the distance learning component. So looking at the findings, I want to focus on basically who has been active, what has been happening. Secondly, identifying how it has been done, what have been the main types of reactions, because there has been some difference there, and then quickly look at some of the critical factors, because I think, as has just been said, one of the biggest challenge for all of us and for the education system is to learn from this experience, and therefore we need to keep monitoring this development. But first of all, who has been reacting and how? I think if there was any doubt on this, the role of governments have come back at the center of the response. And we see that the role of governments has been critical in defining the way in which different countries have been able to adapt and change. The role of governments in different ways. First of all, in the way in which governments had set up preparedness schemes. Had they already been engaged in a process of preparation for digital learning? Had they set up online tools? Had they set up virtual classrooms or so? So we see in the countries that work with a big spectrum of difference here, and preparedness there is a key factor. We have the example of Turkey in the sector of skills development, where given the great emphasis that Turkey had put on previous education reforms on the digitalization, area, they were able to really respond fast, mobilize the tools they already had, and amplify it even beyond their expectations. So in the report, we give some more detail about it. So the question of preparedness, both in terms of policies, in terms of tools, in terms of training of core numbers of teachers, and also the familiarity of learners with some of these practices have been obviously key. The second key aspect for the success of the response has been the ability of governments to mobilize public-private partnerships in different ways. And we have seen, and we have also heard from the previous panel, that the private sector is very engaged in this sector, and that there is willingness on their side. And indeed, we have seen that from many different examples, from Serbia to Macedonia to others, countries have been able to mobilize key partnerships to create platforms, test new ideas, and they have then adapted over the past 2-3 months to respond to this. So this ability to coordinate and engage has been key. Obviously, some of the partnerships are with other public bodies, in some cases national broadcasting cooperation or so, but this ability to create this ecosystem that we talk about a lot in many of our discussions on education reforms, well, it became one of the success factors for the implementation of the response to COVID. Another thing we have seen is that if you take COVID as a stress test, if you see, COVID puts a stress on the system, what has been the natural response of most countries has been to privilege a response focusing on what they consider the key components of the education and training system, mainly general education, final exams, and core subjects within that. This is understandable and it's laudable. However, it just, in a sense, amplifies the fragilities that are in the systems. And if you look in particular at the vocational training, the technical training side of the systems, you see that even in this moment, they were the part of the system which has had most difficulty to adapt to change, partly because the level of investment in digital approaches was lower before, partly because it's less amenable. If you have to do practical training, it's more difficult to bring it into this virtual reality, but also because the system was not a priority in the first wave in many countries, not in all, but in many. So there again, we see that the diversity of the response has been quite critical. We have also seen that the response has followed the general trend of the education and training reforms that were already in the countries. So we had countries that have already engaged in a regionalization process before, while COVID has been a push to use that and give more responsibilities, in some cases also access to some more resources to the regional or local levels to use these reform efforts in order to amplify and improve the response. So very quickly, this is just the first point. The second point on what has actually happened, if we look at what has happened, I will not surprise you there, but the main response has been across many countries using broadcasting as a way of bringing lessons to the big numbers that we're talking about, broadcasting either through television or streaming, so finding ways of broadcasting some of the work, and the second has been to start building or developing or activating some of the online platforms, and some of them you have heard before, so I will not go into that. One of the interesting things linked to this, which was maybe what defined a bit more the response, is that social media has shown to become a spontaneous go-to in order to allow the broadcasting and the streaming options to become more interactive. And so social media has been accompanying this process, and in some examples we see that now is being harnessed also to start using it for feedback and for the more systematic interaction in some settings. The other dimension, the platforms we are using even for this conference, we have many video streaming and video group call systems. This has somehow been also one of the defining responses. We see though that the capacity to adapt the teaching approaches through the new video group call systems is limited, and it's only been in the countries that had already started with the concept of virtual classrooms that they've been able to harness the potential of this change. So the how is quite differentiated, and we see not simply across the countries, but across the types of education segments that the response has been very different. If we go to now the last part of my remarks, which is the critical factors, I would say the first critical factor in all of these has been the question of inclusion. And if you look at systems, that's where the move to online has highlighted and amplified some of the differences, has pointed to the deficiencies in equipment and connectivity. Even in well-developed, in more developed countries, this has become an issue. Obviously, the proportions are very different, but the question of inclusion is there. And in the question of training, of vocational training in particular, given the types of schools and equipment available before and the types of population, this is a major issue. So an issue that, in fact, has to be addressed and is being addressed in some cases, but needs to be put squarely at the center of our ongoing learning and monitoring. The second critical factor has been the teachers and the response there. We have seen some countries putting in place very quickly teacher training, distance learning programs, access to different opportunities, either through national agencies or through private companies. This diversity reflected the capacity of governments to also mobilize internal resources. But we have seen that overall, the capacity of teachers to adapt to the situation has been, in all cases, surpassing expectations. Or the work we're doing on monitoring shows that there has been an effort that goes beyond what would have been expected before. And this somehow is one of the positives that needs to be harnessed as we move forward, and has to be put more in value. Another critical factor has been the capacity to develop and the inclusion of parents and families into the teaching process, into the learning process and the learning. As you know, as we entered into this COVID-19 situation, and even the previous speaker ended with the reference to the Sustainable Development Goals, in a Sustainable Development Goal framework, we were talking about a learning crisis because there is a lot of teaching going on in the world, and schools and courses and all of this. But when we measure the learning dimension, we see that this learning is not matching the increase in teaching or others. So somehow this question of the gap between what teaching is provided and what learning actually occurs is also part of the critical factors that we are seeing. And I see one of the key developments there is the difficulty to have an approach which is more learner-centered. So I think it's important to bear in mind this dimension, and learner center in this context also takes into account the social context. So in many cases, the parents dimension. There is also, obviously, when we look at this a number and we look at different countries, many countries, some countries have multilingual, have more than one national language. So questions of how you adapt and take these into account, question of having more access to smartphones rather than other technologies. So how smartphones becomes the interface. So there is a lot going on, but there is no time to go into this. The report shows some of our thinking. But if I just highlight just a few keywords, because I know we are a bit over time, the critical factors point us into thinking towards the question of monitoring and quality and how we learn from the current situation. It points to the issue of specificity of the skills training, and this cannot all be done online, or it requires different approaches, and those different approaches are still starting. There are some good examples, but we really need to make some progress. Some businesses have also tried to come up with their own solutions to deliver some of this training and some of this dual training there, but there is still, I think, there reflection to be done. We are now moving from a situation of emergency to one which is more structural, and this is the phase where we need to feedback the learning from the crisis into some structural approaches. And one is already being done on the question of assessment and certification. How can you adapt and improve and revisit your system of assessment? And I think the colleague from Amazon before also highlighted the need to have for employers reliable qualifications. But okay, in this situation, this is becoming quite critical. So I will stop there. If you're interested in a more detailed assessment, you can go to our website and the report. Thanks.